Hey, welcome back, History of Motion Pictures students, beloved evergreen History of Motion Picture students. I guess that came out to be humps before. So I guess that's what you are, be humps. Anyway, we are talking about our next silent film comedian great. So take out some paper to get some notes. The expectation is that you have that you have taken notes and watched this whole thing before coming in on Friday, so you have some context here. So we talked about Chaplin extensively. We are now moving on to one of the other great silent comedians, Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton is that's not his real name. That was his given, and his name was given actually because of something that happened when he was performing as a kid. But anyway, let's talk about Buster Keaton here. And I wanted to say from the get-go that Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, although some people want to talk about them as rivals, they were not rivals in the sense of trying to compete with each other. They were contemporaries of each other, and they respected each other, often communicated with each other about things. But I'm often asked by students, well, which one do you like better, Chaplin or Keaton? And because those two tend to be the ones that rise to the top, although that's a travesty because next time we're going to be talking about Harold Lloyd, and I really see them as the triumvirate of silent comedy, Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd. And they are all very, very different. So if people say, Mr. Hebert, you have to pick. No, I don't have to pick because I have access to Chaplin, I have access to Keaton, and I can have them both on that hypothetical desert island. But what you guys are going to discover is that they just are very, very different in their approach. They make very, very different kind of movies, and their approach in front of the camera and behind the camera, very, very different. Now, one of the things we want to make sure we understand is that Buster Keaton was often referred to as the Great Stone Face. And the reason is this persona, not a character, okay? The tramp was a character. Buster Keaton does not have a recurring character, but he does have a persona that is recurring, and that is this stone face, this deadpan expression where he does not smile. And it doesn't mean he doesn't have expression. It doesn't mean there is no emotion. It's just that this is a persona that he built out of vaudeville, and he found it to be a perfect visual expression of his philosophy. And it's going to be kind of hard to explain in words, but the more you see it in film, you'll begin to pick up on why it works. So you're not going to see him with this tremendous different kind of facial expressions, but that doesn't mean emotions are not being communicated. There absolutely will be joy and happiness and frustration and anger and all of this, fear, but he does it with other means, especially his eyes, his expressive eyes. So he started, he's an American, different from Chaplin. He's an American, but he also started in vaudeville, an American vaudeville, even as a child. And he was part of a family group called the Three Keatons, which included his mom and his dad. And they were very physical and acrobatic in their comedy. He was used in kind of this knockabout sketch as the human mop, as the father literally swept the floor with his child's outstretched body. So he was an accomplished acrobat, and he knew how to take falls without hurting himself. He by a very young age was a very experienced comic and a sense of comic timing. The name Buster actually apparently came from Harry Houdini, who, when he was only 6 months old, he tumble down a flight of stairs unharmed, and because he could take those busts, he could bust himself up and still be okay. But yeah, he worked in vaudeville, and he was thrown all over the stage. He was thrown into the audience, and no matter what the stunt was, he was that stone face, that poker face. Unfortunately, by the time he was about 21, his father was getting too much into alcoholism, and the stunts became too dangerous to perform, and so those kinds of acts dissolved. And by this time, he was picked up to go into the movies, to start doing shorts. Okay, here's a picture of the three Keatons. There's Father Joe, who actually later performs in a number of Keaton's films. So he's picked up by movie producer Joseph Schenck. Now, Joseph Schenck was doing comedy, different from Max Sennett, but doing one-reelers and two-reelers. And Buster Keaton Joseph Schenck wanted to partner Buster Keaton up with an already established comedian, Roscoe Arbuckle, known as Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, because he was a big, rather rotund young man. And they were a good contrast. They were a good pairing. You notice a lot of comedy duos like Laurel and Hardy, like Abbott and Costello. They're all about contrasts, physically especially. You quite often have a heavier set individual with a skinnier individual, or tall and short. And this works really well with comedy. And they both did. They were both doing very well. Keaton was more of the supporting player, but again, kind of the comedy duo partnership. Unfortunately, with Arbuckle, there were some problems personally, outside of things. He got involved in some scandals which ended up being affecting in his career. And Keaton was building up his chops as not only a film performer, but understanding how to direct and create and write films. And so after a couple of years, Joseph Schenck primarily concentrated on Buster Keaton films. In fact, he would actually purchase one of the Chaplin, Joseph Schenck purchased one of the Chaplin studios, which later became the Buster Keaton Studio. And by 1921, he changed the name of the production company to Buster Keaton Productions. Now, one of the things we're going to see with Buster Keaton is his approach to comedy. Now, I'm just going to say it from the get-go. There's physical comedy, and then there's Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton is easily the most physical of all the physical comics. The kinds of things that he does is so different from Chaplin, is so different from Lloyd. Lloyd comes a little bit closer to it, but never quite in the way that Buster Keaton does it. Chaplin's comedy, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Chaplin's comedy is very intimate. Chaplin likes to work with things that he can hold onto in his hand, or things that he can sit on, like the Oceana rolls, or the boot being cooked, or the noodles in the nightclub at in City Lights, for example, right? That's not Keaton. Keaton is very comfortable with his comedies being really big, his obstacles being really big. He would have an ocean liner as his source of comedy in The Navigator, or a locomotive in The General. An entire boat, an entire house, a herd of cattle, a waterfall, a spinning house, a steamboat. These are all the subjects and the sources of his comedy. Very big. That's one of the things you want to keep in mind. And also the opponents, the antagonists. I call what I see with Buster Keaton is kind of the 1-2-10 rule, where you start with one cop, then you get to two, and then the next thing you know, you're up against the entire police force. Or it's one little rock, then a second little rock, then the next thing you know, it's an avalanche of huge boulders, like in Seven Chances in that film. So a whole tribe of jungle savages, the whole entire Union and Confederate armies. That's how it is. It's never just one or two. It's always really, really big. That's one of his approach. And always the physical comedy, the most physical of the physical comics. So a couple of shorts I wanted to point out. One Week is about a newlywed couple, and they get together. They have a do-it-yourself, build-your-home kit. And in their 1 week, they need to put together their own house. And it ends in comic catastrophe. But it's a lot of fun. Really considered, because by now he's starting to write and direct or co-direct his films. This is really considered his first masterpiece. Now, The Playhouse is not unique in the sense that he used trick photography here, but I do want to point it out because it's he was not opposed to using trick photography, but never, ever, ever for the stunt. Okay, when you see the stunt, you are seeing Buster. You are seeing him do it. There was no stunt double. There was no green screen. There's no wires and things. He's actually doing it. But he very much understands movies and understands and likes to play with different kinds of effects. In the movie, in the short film, The Playhouse, he plays nearly every single character. He's all of the people in the audience. He's all of the people in the orchestra. He plays this monkey character that's performing. He's women, he's men, he's old, he's young, all using some very sophisticated cinematic techniques. When he starts to get into features, he has a lot more opportunity for his big kind of physical comedy, like I said. I like these series of pictures here because it shows him quickly going into this pratfall flip, and he just gets up, and you have the poker face, the stone face, as he does it. Of course, that flat pork pie hat is another part of his iconic wardrobe, in the same way that the derby hat and the cane would be for the tramp. We always think of Chaplin with the pork pie hat. But not always. You see it in a lot of his films, but not in every film. Again, the pork pie hat, I'm sorry, the stone face is not a character. It's a persona. Okay, so let's little bit of review about some things. So, as a filmmaker, he's honestly considered the best of the silent comedian filmmakers. Much more than Chaplin. He really understands movies more than any other silent comedian. He understands how to use the frame to build the gag. I mean, there's actually some really good stuff that we can talk about later about how where you put that stinking camera makes a huge difference in how the gag is going to work. And how he uses the frame from left to right and back forward. It's almost like perpendicular lines, and we'll talk about that. Okay, side to side and front to back. His use of editing, again, he never ever wanted to hide things in editing like the gags or the stunts, but you will see his editing is so precise. For example, Richard Lester, who's a more contemporary British filmmaker, when he was talking about Buster Keaton's film The General, he said, look at The General, every single shot is necessary. You can't take out one shot. They're all a necessary part of it. And the special properties of film. So like I said, he wasn't opposed to using certain I should say special properties like optical effects. I don't want trick photography, but everything that you see with the stunts, with the comic gags is real, is all real. He's actually a much more respected filmmaker than Charlie Chaplin, and I would agree with that. Because of that, he really tried to limit the use of title cards and as much as possible tell everything visually as much as possible. to use the frame, to use the characters and the staging of it all to to um, to give that information. And you'll notice that he uses, excuse me, he uses a lot of wide shots, because when you place the camera in the right place, you can give information about the foreground, the background, and actually set up the next gag by giving that information to the audience. If you look at most other features' use of title cards, he was probably averaging about 50 something, whereas other, regular features were using 100, 150 something title cards. So he really tried to limit that. Now that stone face persona, that allows for a lot of ambiguity with his emotions and circumstance. And sort of the philosophy that comes out of that is, you get knocked down, you keep getting up. There's a kind of perseverance that is displayed in that stone face that we can root for. As I said, he is the most physical of all the silent comedians, and all the stunts are real. When you see him jumping off buildings or falling into the ocean and all of this, I mean, he broke bones. There's a scene in one film where he actually fell and broke his neck, and the shot just keeps going. He gets up, and they didn't discover that he had actually fractured a bone until years and years later. So like I said, there is some trick photography like in the Playhouse or Sherlock Jr., but it's for a purpose, but it is never, ever with the stunts. In fact, he was adamant that you see everything wide shot. You don't break up the stunt through the editing. You make sure that they know it's real, the audience knows it's real, and the audience knows it's Buster actually doing it. You're going to be very, very impressed and entertained by what Buster can do in film. As I mentioned, the comedy on a much grander scale, certainly compared to Chaplin, like we talked about. Again, notice how the editing is necessary and avoided during the gag. During the actual gag, I already mentioned that before, so it's kind of good overlap. And let's talk about those female characters. Now, Chaplin, those female characters, they're like angels. Their feet don't touch the ground when they walk. They are never, ever, at least the lead ones, are never, ever the object of the gag. Now, in Keaton, a completely different rule. He is absolutely fine with the pie in the face with the women and the women getting stuffed into potato sacks and slipping all over the place. They are very much a part of the gag and the physical comedy, because his approach is not about the angelic nature of women, but about the quirkiness of women and the fickleness in a fun way of women. It is a lot of fun. So again, not about better or worse with Chaplin and Keaton, but just different. So pay attention to that and how he treats his women. So let's talk about some of his features here. Not his first feature, but The Three Ages is actually a parody of D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, in that you have three different time periods in history, all starring Keaton, and the different sort of obstacles that he goes through. They all have to do with romance, of course. You have the Stone Age, you have the Roman Age, and you have the Modern Age. Highly recommend this one. Sherlock Jr., it's a sort of a featurette. It's about 45 minutes. This is Keaton as a movie projectionist who really wants to be a detective. And it has this very, very famous sequence in which Keaton, as the projectionist, jumps into the movie itself, jumps into a movie screen. And so he literally plays with all of the formal properties of film. And as always, an amazing chase sequence that is thrilling and entertaining. Actually, let me go back to Sherlock Jr. There's some really sophisticated use of visual techniques that that Keaton said in an interview some years later that cinematographers were still wondering afterwards how he did some of these things. The Navigator is about Keaton and a young lady on an ocean liner, but it turns out they are the only ones on there. And how do you navigate that boat back to safety? And for a while, they don't even know that each other is on the boat. There's parts where he has to fix the boat and go into a diving suit under the water, deal with jungle savages. And again, part of that characteristic Keaton approach to comedy, where we use the whole ocean liner, something Chaplin would not be interested in doing. That's not his approach. Seven Chances, Buster Keaton is a young bachelor who has to get married within a certain time frame in order to inherit all of this money. Well, the problem is it gets out to the public, so of course every eligible young lady wants to get married, and it ends in this epic chase sequence involving not only hundreds of brides but huge boulders, and yeah, it is a lot of fun. The General is probably considered one of the most of his respected films of the 20s, the silent films. It's a Civil War film about a train engineer in the South. Now, let me just say from the beginning, just because he's in the South doesn't mean we're going all D.W. Griffith racist on it. It doesn't even go there. It's a rescue mission. It's a love story. And it's two of the most amazing chase sequences ever put on film, as Buster Keaton's character is trying to rescue his beloved from the enemy, which happens to be the Union. And then one of the last of his silent masterpieces is Steamboat Bill Jr., this young man coming to kind of take over father's business as a steamboat operator. Incidentally, Steamboat Willie takes its name. The Mickey Mouse cartoon, Steamboat Willie, takes its title from the Buster Keaton film here. And again, talking about ending in using huge things. This hurricane, this cyclone comes to the town, and falling buildings and wind. And this is something Chaplin would never do. This is Keaton. And there's actually one of the most famous sequences in all of film history where an entire wall of a building, of a house, falls down and nearly kills Keaton, except for the fact that there's an open window and he happens to be right there where the opening is, and it doesn't kill him. It just falls over on him. Oh, it's so good. It is so good. Maybe we should watch that one. Now, we've talked a little bit about the transition to sound, and like I said before, we're going to get into a little bit more about it. But Keaton was different from other filmmakers. A lot of filmmakers and performers like Chaplin. Chaplin did not want things to go to sound. He did not feel like there was anything wrong with pantomime and silent film. And I agree with Chaplin in that way, but it was just the nature of what people liked. It was a new technology. Keaton, on the other hand, he was not afraid of talkies. He was not afraid of sound. He had a great baritone voice. A lot of performers did not make the transition well because they didn't sound right. They didn't have good voices, but he had a great speaking voice. He was used to doing live theater on vaudeville, so he embraced it. He had total creative control in how his films were made and everything like that up until this point. But MGM approached him and offered him a contract to which he would make a lot more money. But the problem was he was going to be giving up a lot of creative control. He did end up taking that contract with something that years later he said was probably the worst mistake of his career. The first two films that he does with MGM, The Cameraman and spite marriage, they do have some essence of that Keaton magic of the features of the earlier films. But you can tell as you watch it that he doesn't have, he's given some opportunity to have that Keaton control in some sequences, but it just loses a lot of its charm, unfortunately. And as the 30s go on, yes, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone to this one yet, but I'll just go ahead and put this in. This is a production photo. Yes, Buster Keaton can smile. Here, I'll go back here. All right, my bad. Forget you saw that. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But let's tell the sad story here first. As the 1930s continues, he begins to appear less and less in film for a couple of reasons. His marriage fell apart, and that put him into depression. He was seeking professional help. He was falling more and more into alcoholism. And if you watch his appearances throughout the 30s, he becomes less a leading role and more a supporting role to things that he can't handle. And I'm going to be honest, there are some parts where you can just tell he is not there. He just is not there. And it's kind of sad. He did do a lot of writing for other comedians. But through the 1940s, by the 1940s, you really don't see him on screen. He's doing writing for other comedians, even in kind of rehashing old gags that he had performed. So that's the low point of the story, where it seems like people had forgotten Keaton. Okay, now we can see that Buster Keaton can smile, but that's not a face you normally see with the great stone face on screen. Okay, but what happens is this. There's a resurgence and a rediscovery of his work in the early 1950s, and we begin to see Buster Keaton momentum that just never really stops throughout, even up until his death in the 1960s. We see him performing in television. There's a film biopic called The Buster Keaton Story that is released. There's one of my favorite episodes of The Twilight Zone that stars Buster Keaton, which is sort of a time travel between somebody in the silent period and someone in the modern period. He appears in a lot of small roles, but noticeable roles in film. So the upswing is that he lives to see that his legacy was appreciated. A lot of people ask, what in the world is going on with this picture here? Well, this is him doing a promotional campaign for BK Oil and, sort of this superhero. And I've had students that say, wait, he doesn't look like a superhero. And I just sort of, put my hand over my face and roll my eyes. And I kind of think, I know, that's the whole point. That's why it's called comedy. That's why it's funny. The stone face with the pork pie hat. He's not supposed to look the superhero role. That's why it's called funny. So you have to work on that. I love the little garters with the socks, too. Here is Buster Keaton later on in his career doing some writing. When he was honored at the Venice Film Festival, I believe it was 1964, he got multiple standing ovations, and just they absolutely appreciated his work. I don't have a slide of it, but sometimes students will say, well, wouldn't it be great if Chaplin and Keaton performed together? Did they ever do anything together? And the answer is yes, they did. We will talk about that maybe on Friday. But his influence still much remains, not just for film lovers like myself, but for filmmakers. So filmmakers like Woody Allen, performers like Bill Murray, filmmaker Wes Anderson. I would say one of the most clear influences of Buster Keaton is on Jackie Chan. If you're not familiar with Jackie Chan, I may point you to some good resources. He's a actor, martial arts performer that comes out of Hong Kong in like the 70s, after, you know, the wave of martial arts mania that comes out of the 60s, and particularly with Bruce Lee in the late 60s and early 70s. But his approach is about action comedy. He's probably one of the only ones of the last 30 years who devotes himself to action comedy. And he clearly cites Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd as being great influences. And if you watch his work, he studies those films. He's very much in control of the stunts and the camera work and the editing. A lot of his American work, Jackie Chan, a lot of his American work that he did, unfortunately, doesn't follow those rules because of the studio system and because of budgets and those kinds of things, which he is very vocal about criticizing. But if you look at his stuff of the 70s and especially the 80s, when he's working with his own stunt team and being able to have a lot of time to get things right, it is absolute magic and funny as can be. Highly recommend checking out Jackie Chan. And when I watch Wall-E, I honestly feel, especially in like the first half of that film, it's almost like a silent film. I feel like I'm watching Buster Keaton, because Wall-E's physical design, just like the stone face, doesn't have a lot of room for expression. But those eyes, the way that Wall-E's eyes are designed, are very much to evoke Buster Keaton's kind of sad eyes. He was sometimes also called Sad Eyes Keaton. So there's the man, the myth, the legend, Buster Keaton, the greatest of the physical comedians, and perhaps the finest filmmaker of silent comedy. I certainly would contend that. So we're going to look at two things from Buster Keaton, and I hope that those are the impetus for you to check out a lot more from Buster Keaton. Maybe we'll do an extra kind of screening of these guys, just so we can watch more of these together. So check out Buster Keaton on Friday the 8th, and I look forward to spending that night with you. And you'll enjoy Buster, I hope, just as much as I do after you see his work. All right, see you Friday.